Yesterday, something happened no one saw coming. The city shimmered in neon and rain. Lights bounced on wet asphalt, like broken glass trying to hold together. People celebrated small victories, oblivious to the tremors moving beneath their feet. A man in a tower watched the chaos unfold on multiple screens. Each headline felt like a drumbeat, relentless, pounding, impossible to ignore. New names. New connections. A story that was supposed to stay buried was now alive, crawling through every corner of Washington. He hadn't slept. He never slept when the world started changing without warning. His reflection in the glass tower was a stranger staring back. The faint hum of the city below reminded him, power is temporary, but exposure lasts forever. The news broke slowly at first. Tweets flashing like warning lights. Subtle, almost accidental leaks. Then came the roar. Networks caught fire. Headlines splintered into subheadings, footnotes, and opinion pieces. Every broadcast felt like it was breathing directly into the nation's chest. He moved through the room like a ghost, aware of every step, every shadow. His aides whispered names he didn't recognize, some forgotten in history, some carved into the present. Each name a key, a lock, a question. Who had known? Who hadn't? And more importantly, who would care once it all hit the floor? The streets outside began to stir. Protesters, reporters, and the curious collided at intersections. Cameras glimmered in puddles. People leaned into their phones, capturing the moment they realized the world was not the same as it was yesterday. Some ran with hope. Others ran from fear. And in the middle of it all, he paused. A single beat of clarity. The city screamed and he realized, this isn't a story about names. It's a story about control, about fragility, about the invisible lines that separate chaos from order. The world was no longer quiet. The rules had changed overnight. Every friend felt like a stranger. Every stranger, a potential enemy. He looked out from the tower, down at the humming streets. A question lingered like smoke: how do you navigate a world where the story isn't yours to write, but yours to survive? Hit subscribe and tell me, what would you do if your world changed overnight? And that's when everything changed. He wasn't born powerful. Not in the way people imagine power, gold-lined rooms or flashing cameras. He was shaped by the city itself, by streets that whispered lessons no school could teach. Concrete and asphalt, neon and smog, these were his classrooms. As a boy, he watched the city breathe. Streetlights flickered like heartbeat monitors, and he learned early that the world moves fast, and sometimes the fast survive while the steady falter. He learned how to bargain, how to persuade, and more importantly, how to disappear when the noise got too loud. There were dreams, too. Quiet, stubborn, dangerous dreams. Dreams of control, of influence, of rewriting the rules that seemed so permanent. But there was always a shadow following him, the fear that everything he wanted could vanish in an instant. That every deal, every handshake, every smile, could turn into a cage. He remembers one night, the wind slicing across a rooftop, rain stinging like tiny needles. He was 16. He had no money, no status, just a notebook full of ideas no one else understood. But he felt something inside him ignite. A promise. That one day, he would touch the strings behind the curtains. That one day, he would see how the machine worked, and bend it to his will. And yet, he was human. Fear clung to him like a second skin. Every betrayal left a scar, every loss echoed in the quiet moments when he sat alone. He loved fiercely, badly, sometimes recklessly. He wanted to be respected. He wanted to be remembered. But more than anything, he wanted to be seen, not as a symbol, not as a headline, but as a man who fought to shape his own fate. The city taught him lessons in mirrors. Every street was a reflection of choice. Every alleyway a reminder, the world doesn't wait. People don't wait. You make a move, or you disappear. And he moved. Always. Calculated, careful, relentless. And that's when the world started to bend for him. Doors opened he hadn't even noticed. Voices whispered his name in rooms he wasn't supposed to enter. And with each step, he understood, influence wasn't inherited. It was earned. It was stolen. It was taken, piece by piece, from the chaos around you. And still, he wondered, at what cost? Because power has a rhythm. It rises, it falls, and sometimes it turns on the one holding it. And that's the truth he carried with him, silently, as he walked among people who only saw the surface. And that's when everything changed. The city had never been quiet, but now it felt louder than ever. Every street corner buzzed with possibility and threat. Neon signs flickered above coffee shops and pawn shops alike, casting fractured light over puddles that mirrored a sky full of clouds. He walked among the crowd, invisible in plain sight, a shadow slipping through a world that was beginning to show cracks. At first, it looked like progress. Headlines promised clarity. Reporters nodded knowingly at each other, as if they'd been let in on some secret. Networks ran their cycles, each story carefully framed. Yet beneath the surface, the rules were shifting. Quietly. Invisibly. Like ice melting under a frozen lake, you couldn't see it until the first crack split the surface and swallowed the light. People began whispering about who knew what. Old friends eyed him differently. Some smiled too brightly, others avoided him altogether. The corridors of power that had once felt safe were now crawling with tension, as if the air itself had become a living thing, waiting to pounce. He felt it first in his own meetings. Advisors who once spoke with certainty now hesitated, fingers tapping pens, eyes darting to screens. Briefings ended abruptly, phone calls were delayed. Decisions that used to feel natural, instinctive, now required maps he didn't have. Something was moving behind the walls, and he didn't yet know its shape. And then came the messages. Not from the press. Not from allies. From the shadows. Encrypted, fragmented, impossible to ignore. Names he thought long buried surfaced again. Connections he had assumed were erased proved stubbornly alive. The city's undercurrent had been building momentum for years, and now it was flooding into the streets, into the headlines, into him. At night, he would stand at the balcony of his tower, look down at the cars snaking through the city like veins carrying an electric pulse, and feel the weight of it all pressing on his chest. Every light in a window was a story, every honk a warning. And in that moment, he realized, no one controls the story completely. The story controls them. Inside, the tension twisted further. His inner circle had fractures he had not anticipated. Loyalty had always been transactional, yes, but he had believed in a foundation, a spine of trust. Now, even those closest to him questioned, plotted, hesitated. Every smile seemed rehearsed. Every nod had weight. Every silence was a mirror reflecting potential betrayal. He could feel the machinery of power creaking. What had once seemed like a well-oiled system was now a fragile sculpture balanced on the edge of a knife. Alliances became temporary bridges, conversations a minefield. One misstep could set the dominoes tumbling, and he knew, deep down, the fall would be merciless. And yet, amid the storm, there was a strange clarity. The cracks revealed patterns that were invisible when everything appeared stable. He began tracing connections, meetings, calls, flights, donations, dinners. A network that seemed random was, in fact, meticulously ordered. The machine had logic, a logic designed not to fail, but to persist, no matter who was in power. The media fed the frenzy. Every leaked memo, every cryptic text message, every quiet nod in a meeting became fuel for speculation. The headlines grew louder, angrier, darker. Citizens watched, fascinated and terrified. They didn't see the human inside the tower. They only saw the headlines, flashing like strobe lights over the city that never slept. Even the advisors began to fracture. Some whispered about exits, retreats, opportunities in safer corners. Others pressed forward, demanding action, demanding answers, demanding control. And he realized, the question was never who would win. It was who decided what winning meant. At night, he sometimes replayed moments from the past, moments he had dismissed as insignificant. A laugh too sharp, a glance too long, a handshake that lingered too much. Now, every detail mattered. Every moment had weight. Every memory was a clue. And the harder he tried to untangle the web, the more it seemed to tighten around him. He began to see patterns of human behavior emerge under pressure. Fear, greed, pride, loyalty, they weren't abstract concepts. They were the fuel driving the machine. And if you could read the fuel, you could anticipate the fire. But the fire was unpredictable. And sometimes, the flames turned inward. He walked past a mural one night, spray paint peeling, the colors faded but vivid enough to tell a story. A figure reaching for something unseen. He stopped. Stared. And for a moment, he felt like that figure. Reaching for clarity, for stability, for a sense of control in a world that had become a storm. And then he realized, control had been an illusion all along. The city moved without him, the story wrote itself, and he was just one actor in a play that refused rehearsal. Friends could betray, enemies could align, secrets could unravel, and in every scenario, the question lingered, who was really steering the ship? Meetings became performances. Conversations, cryptic dances. Decisions, calculated risks on a chessboard where the rules shifted mid-game. And the more he pushed, the more resistance appeared. The tension wasn't just outside him, it was inside him. The city mirrored his mind, restless, fractured, dangerous. Sometimes he slept with the windows open, letting the wind cut across his face. The sounds of the city were his lullaby and his warning. Car alarms, shouting, laughter, engines, each note a reminder that the world did not pause for anyone. That life, chaos, and truth had their own rhythm. Every phone ping, every alert, every knock on the door became a potential spark. Every glance, every smile, every word carried weight. And he felt it, the friction building, the pressure rising, the inevitability of revelation. The machine was awakening. And he could either master it, or be consumed by it. One night, alone in the tower, he realized the most dangerous cracks were not the ones outside. They were inside. The doubts. The questions. The morality and the desire, interwoven into a tapestry too complex for anyone to read fully. Power demanded sacrifice. And sacrifice demanded truth, sometimes truths no one could bear to hear. And then came the quiet moments. Pauses in the chaos where only the hum of the city existed. He would sit, staring into the darkness, and feel the tension like a living thing pressing against him. And in those moments, he understood, there is no neutrality in this world. Only decisions, and the weight of their consequences. The question was never who won, but who decided what winning means. The city never sleeps, but sometimes it whispers. And last night, the whispers became impossible to ignore. He found himself in a room he had walked past 100 times, a conference room bathed in fluorescent light, cold and sterile. Papers stacked high on the table, screens flickering, phones buzzing with encrypted messages. And yet, the real story wasn't on the screens. The story was in the spaces between them, the pauses, the glances, the half-sentenced thoughts that no one dared speak aloud. The system didn't fail. That was the first truth he had to swallow. It had been built this way. Purposefully. Methodically. Every law, every loophole, every handshake designed to protect itself, to endure, to perpetuate the patterns of power regardless of the people inside it. And he had been part of it. Not willingly, not naively, but inevitably. He had danced along the edges, pulled strings, cut deals, and still, the machine moved independently, indifferent to his intentions. The realization hit him like cold rain on the rooftop: freedom, influence, even fame, these were illusions. Dependencies masked as victories. Wins that could vanish the moment the machinery decided to shift. Documents flashed across the screens. Financial trails, flight logs, private meetings long forgotten. The names lined up like dominoes, falling one into another, revealing a network so intricate it was almost beautiful, if beauty could be measured in secrecy and control. Every layer pulled back exposed another layer, and each revelation carried weight, moral and practical. He saw patterns he hadn't noticed before. People assumed power was linear, hierarchical. But it wasn't. It was fractal, like a network that replicated itself endlessly, bending around obstacles, absorbing dissent, transforming threats into leverage. And in that fractal, in that hidden architecture, he understood, there were no accidents. Every headline, every leak, every scandal carefully calibrated to maintain balance, to preserve the system while it appeared chaotic. He recalled meetings with men and women who had smiled too easily, who had spoken in tones that felt rehearsed. They weren't corrupt, exactly. They were precise. Efficient. Participants in a machine bigger than any individual ambition. And for years, he had mistaken their efficiency for loyalty, their compliance for consent. It struck him, the power he thought he held was a fraction of the truth. He could influence the public, sway decisions, write op-eds, hold rallies, command attention. But the deeper currents of control, the invisible strings that guided the outcomes he cared about, those were beyond reach. And suddenly, the headlines that shook the city weren't anomalies. They were symptoms. He watched a map unfold on one screen. Flight paths, meeting logs, anonymous donations. Each line connected, each point calculated, each anomaly a potential threat. It wasn't chaos. It was order. A web that had existed long before him, long before anyone alive could remember. And in the center of it all, he realized, the world he thought he was shaping had been shaping him. He felt the weight of complicity. Not direct wrongdoing, but participation. Witnessing, nodding, acting, believing he was steering, when in truth, he was part of the currents. And yet, even in this revelation, a strange sense of freedom emerged. If he could see the structure, the logic, then perhaps he could anticipate it. Predict it. Navigate it. Perhaps even bend it, carefully, subtly, without shattering the fragile balance. He remembered a night years ago, alone in a similar room. He had believed then that knowledge was power. But now he understood the nuance: knowledge was survival. Survival was influence. Influence was an illusion unless paired with understanding. And understanding demanded honesty, brutal, clear, unsentimental honesty with oneself. The revelations weren't just about names, dates, or events. They were about patterns of behavior, the architecture of secrecy, the human need to protect, conceal, and manipulate. Each exposed thread connected to fear, ambition, or greed. And in these threads, he saw reflections of himself, the compromises, the bargains, the silent approvals. In the silence of the room, he traced the lines. Connections he had assumed were harmless now carried consequences he hadn't imagined. Allies became potential threats. Enemies became predictable. And the public? They saw only fragments, flashes of a story curated to maintain the illusion of transparency. He realized something vital: the truth the world demanded was not the truth that existed. What looked like freedom was dependency. What looked like scandal was orchestration. What appeared as failure was, in many ways, success, for the machine itself. And in that quiet, glowing room, he began to feel the weight of responsibility differently. It wasn't about preserving his name. It wasn't about controlling headlines or tweets or public opinion. It was about navigating a system that would outlive him, outsmart him, and continue without pause, unless he learned its rules. He saw the paradox clearly now. The more he understood the machine, the less control he had over appearances. The more he acted decisively, the more he risked becoming a footnote in the narrative it constructed. And yet, he had a choice, to retreat into fear, or to act with deliberate awareness. To play his part wisely, knowing the stage was bigger than any one actor. He moved through the room slowly, absorbing every detail. Each screen, each file, each message was a pulse, a heartbeat of the hidden city. And in that moment, he realized the city itself was a living organism, and he had been a small, moving cell, unaware of the system sustaining it. The truth unfolded like a map without a legend. Connections became evident, motives transparent, and yet the enormity of it was overwhelming. Every thread he pulled revealed another layer, another shadow, another calculation. And he understood, the world he thought he controlled was never his to control. And yet, he wasn't powerless. Not completely. Insight was a weapon. Awareness, a shield. And strategy, carefully observed, meticulously executed, could allow him to navigate these waters without being consumed. He stared at the maps, the documents, the screens. A deep, philosophical calm settled over him. Fear was inevitable. Confusion was unavoidable. But clarity, rare, precious, and dangerous, had arrived. The room felt colder now, but quieter too. The storm outside continued, city lights blinking, sirens wailing, phones buzzing, but inside, in this revelation, he understood the invisible architecture that had long guided his life and decisions. And for the first time in years, he felt a fragile sense of agency. Not absolute control. Not triumph. But understanding. A map of possibility drawn across a landscape of inevitable chaos. The machine was vast. Merciless. Immutable in many ways. But it was not invincible. And the patterns, now visible, now understood, offered him a chance to navigate, to survive, to influence outcomes in ways he had never imagined. And he whispered to himself, quietly, almost in awe. What looks like freedom, is dependency. What appears as failure, is structure. And the game, is bigger than I ever thought. He stepped back from the screens. Took a deep breath. And in that moment, he saw clearly, the story the world saw was only half the truth. The other half, the dangerous half, existed behind the curtain. And he was standing there, finally, seeing the threads for the first time. And that was the night the hidden city spoke. He felt the storm before he saw it. Not in the clouds, not in the wind. It was inside him, a tremor running through his chest, a pulse echoing in his skull. The city roared outside, indifferent, alive, unaware that somewhere above it all, a man was unraveling. At first, it was subtle. A flicker in the corner of his vision. A memory that refused to stay buried. A message half-read, a voice on the phone that seemed different than yesterday. Small tremors became tidal waves. The system he had once admired, once believed he understood, now loomed over him like a living thing, vast, intricate, implacable. And then came the realization. He could no longer see the edges of control. Every decision he had made, every alliance, every promise, they were threads in a tapestry far larger than he had imagined. Threads he could tug, yes, but threads that might unravel everything if he pulled too hard. Fear had always been part of him, but now it was sharpened, refined, unavoidable. He sat alone in the high-rise apartment, lights from the streets below painting moving rectangles across the walls. Every honk, every siren, every muffled shout reminded him of the stakes. The city didn't sleep. And neither could he. You can't buy freedom. You can't legislate fairness. You can only choose who you'll be when everything falls apart. The words echoed in his mind like a mantra, a warning, a command. And he realized he had been chasing illusions. Fame, influence, power, all seductive, all temporary. The truth, he now understood, was raw and human. It was in choices. In courage. In endurance. In facing the storm without flinching. Outside, the headlines blared. Networks dissected, analysts pontificated, the public gawked. But he knew they were seeing only a shadow of the reality. A show designed to distract, to entertain, to maintain a fragile sense of control. The real storm raged behind the curtain, in hallways and conference rooms, in whispered deals and calculated silences. And he was in the middle of it, unarmed but aware. He remembered faces from his past, allies who had smiled and then turned, enemies who had vanished and reappeared, opportunists who had waited patiently for him to stumble. All of them part of the same rhythm, the same machine. And the more he observed, the more he felt the impossible weight of inevitability pressing down. It wasn't just politics. It wasn't just power. It was life, compressed into a series of decisions, each one a potential catastrophe or salvation. And in that compression, he saw clearly, the world did not forgive hesitation. The world did not reward fear. Only action, deliberate and precise, offered a path forward. Memories collided with the present. Nights spent strategizing, days spent negotiating, years spent building influence. Every misstep replayed, every compromise examined under the harsh light of inevitability. And he realized the truth he had been avoiding: he was not infallible. He was human. Fragile. Vulnerable. But in that fragility, there was also potential, the potential to act with integrity, to act with courage, to redefine the rules he had always assumed were fixed. The storm outside mirrored the storm within. Rain pelted the windows, wind rattled the frames, thunder rolled through the city like a warning drum. And he let himself feel it fully: fear, doubt, exhaustion, regret, all of it. Not as weakness, but as clarity. The storm was necessary. It was cleansing. It was awakening. And then came a moment of clarity. He could see the pattern, not just in the system, but in himself. The choices he had made, the compromises, the betrayals, they had shaped him, yes, but they had also taught him. Strength is forged in chaos. Wisdom emerges from risk. And courage, the kind that mattered, is not the absence of fear, but the resolve to move forward despite it. He stood by the window, the city sprawled beneath him like a living map of ambition, deception, and human striving. And for the first time in months, he felt a sense of agency. Not absolute, not invulnerable, but real. And fragile. And beautiful in its impermanence. The world demanded action, demanded clarity, demanded response. And he chose, deliberately, painfully, with full awareness of risk, to step forward, to confront the chaos rather than retreat from it. To engage with the storm rather than wait for it to pass. In the quiet that followed, after decisions were made and plans set into motion, he felt something unexpected. Release. A momentary calm that comes not from control, but from acceptance. From understanding that some things cannot be changed, but all things can be faced. He remembered the people he had relied on, advisors, allies, confidants. Some would falter. Some would rise. But their presence, their decisions, their loyalty or betrayal, all of it would now play into the storm he was embracing. And he would navigate it. Step by step, choice by choice. And then came the echo, the realization that would stay with him long after the city lights dimmed: the storm was not the enemy. It was the teacher. It revealed who could endure, who could decide, who could act when everything else threatened to collapse. The storm demanded courage. The storm demanded clarity. The storm demanded truth. And he had all three: uneven, imperfect, human, alive. He moved away from the window. The city continued its endless rhythm, unaware of the battles fought in silent rooms above it. But he was changed. Not victorious. Not defeated. Just changed. Forged, tempered, awake. And then, silence spoke louder. The city finally seemed to breathe. Not in celebration, not in panic, just a quiet exhale that rippled through streets, alleyways, and high-rises alike. Lights hummed softly against the fading night. Rain had stopped, but puddles reflected a sky that was still heavy with clouds. Somewhere, a dog barked. A car idled. Life moved, quietly, almost politely, as if it had learned restraint. He walked slowly through his apartment, barefoot on polished floors, the quiet of the space pressing in after the storm of the last few weeks. The revelations, the tension, the chaos, it all felt distant now, like echoes from another life. And yet, he knew they were never truly gone. Shadows lingered. Lessons remained. Choices remembered themselves. He looked out the window at the streets below. Neon signs flickered back to life, people returned to routines, laughter re-emerged. And in that movement, he saw a truth he had glimpsed but never fully embraced: freedom isn't guaranteed. It's fragile. Temporary. But it's passed down, preserved in moments of bravery, in decisions made when fear screams the loudest, in honesty that no headline can capture. He remembered the storm, the fear, the doubt, the tension that had gripped him and the city. And he realized the storm had been a teacher. It had stripped away illusions, revealing not the machine, not the headlines, not the people, but the essence of himself. The choices he had made in silence, the moments when courage outweighed fear, the instances when he had acted not for power but for clarity, these were what mattered. Sometimes, the hardest truths are the simplest. Sometimes, the loudest silence is the one inside you. He sat in a chair, leaning back, eyes closing for a brief moment. The world outside was moving, relentless, but inside, there was space to reflect. To breathe. To remember why he had begun this journey at all. The city had shaped him. The machine had tested him. And in the crucible of chaos, he had discovered something vital: humanity is measured not by triumph or defeat, but by the choices made when nothing is certain. He thought of the people whose names had surfaced, whose lives had intersected with the chaos he had navigated. Some had acted bravely. Some had acted selfishly. Some had vanished, leaving empty spaces that carried more meaning than any presence could. And he understood: judgment is fleeting. Compassion is rare. Clarity is precious. And every human act leaves a mark, visible or invisible, on the fabric of life. He rose and walked to the balcony. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wet asphalt and the distant tang of the river. He watched people moving below, hurried, distracted, alive. They didn't know the full story. They never would. And yet, the lessons of the storm lived in each quiet heartbeat, each small choice made in ordinary moments. So when your moment comes, what will you stand for? He traced a finger along the railing, thinking not of headlines or power, not of fame or infamy, but of continuity. Of responsibility. Of the delicate thread connecting past and future. He realized that life doesn't wait for anyone. History doesn't pause. And truth, though messy and inconvenient, persists only when someone chooses to honor it. He remembered the advice of an old mentor, words spoken years ago during a time of uncertainty: the world bends toward understanding only when someone is willing to bend first. He had never fully grasped it then. Now, the words resonated. Actions, courage, and deliberate thought were the tools through which one could navigate the chaos without losing oneself. And he understood something else. Resolution does not mean victory. Reflection does not erase pain. Light does not banish shadow. But even in small moments, a deep breath, a pause, a conscious choice, there is power. There is freedom. There is hope. The city below sparkled with muted brilliance. Neon signs hummed a lullaby to those still awake, a promise of continuity amidst uncertainty. He realized that life is rarely neat. Stories rarely end cleanly. But there is meaning in endurance. In being present. In witnessing the storm and choosing, intentionally, to rise from it without surrendering to despair. And in that awareness, he felt peace. Not complete, not perfect, but earned. If this story made you think, share it. Because truth survives only when it's told. He turned from the balcony, lights dimmed around him, shadows stretching gently along the walls. And in the quiet, he whispered to himself, almost to the city itself, almost to the listener who had followed this journey through chaos and revelation. And maybe, that's how it all begins again. The city never truly sleeps. It waits. Patient, observant, indifferent. And in that stillness, new tremors began to surface. Even after the storm had passed, the fallout had not. Reports emerged like sparks catching on dry grass, small at first, almost ignorable, until the fire spread. New names appeared. Old connections were revisited. The system, which had seemed laid bare, began to reassert itself in ways both subtle and alarming. He watched the headlines scroll across his screen, the glow reflected in his eyes. Every story felt like a ripple against a wall, small on its own, but relentless. The public, oblivious to the full scope, reacted with fury, curiosity, fascination. Every tweet, every post, every news alert became part of the narrative. And he understood the truth: perception can be as powerful as reality, especially when reality is tangled in shadows. In the hallways of power, whispers mutated into conversations, and conversations mutated into strategy. Advisors debated in hushed tones, weighing options, considering the consequences of every word. Some advocated retreat, some aggression, some cunning patience. And he realized that the storm had not ended. It had only evolved. The rules had shifted again, subtly, invisibly. And the city felt it. Streets hummed with tension. Reporters lingered near entrances, microphones ready, cameras primed. Protesters gathered quietly, voices soft but determined, eyes sharp. In the cafes, whispers of conspiracy mingled with the aroma of coffee and pastries. Everyone, it seemed, was waiting for the next move. He felt the pressure mounting. Decisions that had once seemed straightforward now demanded layers of consideration. Allies could falter. Enemies could re-emerge. Every interaction was a potential spark for a fire he might not control. And yet, he could not retreat. Not now. Not when the game had grown more complex, more layered, more dangerous. He traced patterns across a series of digital maps, connecting dots, lines, and timelines. Each revelation illuminated another piece of the puzzle, and each piece carried a weight he could not ignore. Loyalty, ambition, secrecy, these were not abstract notions. They were forces, tangible, shifting, and sometimes violent in their implications. The city itself became a mirror of his internal state. Neon lights reflected uncertainty. Rain-slicked streets mirrored doubt. Shadows moved like ghosts, reminders of decisions made and consequences deferred. And as he observed it all, he understood: control had always been relative. Influence, temporary. Even power, when measured against the currents of human ambition, was fragile. Late into the night, he convened his inner circle. They sat in a dimly lit room, voices low, faces tense. Every word spoken carried double meaning, every glance a question. Strategies were proposed, debated, discarded. And in the silence between sentences, he felt the weight of responsibility heavier than ever. The system was alive, evolving, and it would test anyone who dared to challenge it. Outside, the city seemed to hold its breath. Sirens cut through the darkness, cars moved in cautious patterns, and shadows clung to corners. The storm had left traces, tension in every movement, hesitation in every gesture, awareness in every glance. People reacted instinctively, sensing the fragility beneath the apparent calm. And he sensed it too, that invisible network of cause and effect, loyalty and betrayal, ambition and fear. It was everywhere, in every corridor, every office, every alley. And the realization struck him sharply: the fallout was no longer about information. It was about influence. About who could sway outcomes, who could predict responses, who could endure scrutiny without losing composure. At one point, he stepped onto a balcony and looked down at the streets. The city glimmered under streetlights, traffic signals blinking, pedestrians moving in waves. And in that beauty, he found a paradox: chaos and order existed simultaneously. One could not survive without the other. The tension he felt was not an anomaly but a law, a pattern of life itself. He thought of past encounters, of choices made in haste, of alliances forged in necessity. Some had survived scrutiny. Others had been exposed and discarded. And in the reflection of the wet streets below, he saw that the game had only just begun. Each decision now carried more weight. Each step had the potential to alter not just outcomes, but perception itself. The phone buzzed. A single message, short, cryptic. Its origin unknown. And in that moment, he realized the delicate truth: the system always speaks, always moves, always reacts. Waiting for him, testing him, demanding response. He could act, yes, but every action came with consequence. Every reaction rippled through a network he had only begun to understand. He felt exhaustion, but not defeat. Awareness replaced fear. Insight replaced panic. He knew the storm outside and the storm within were connected. Each personal choice, each strategic maneuver, each observation of the city below fed into the greater narrative. And he understood: survival now demanded adaptation, not brute force. And as dawn approached, casting pale light over buildings, streets, and the restless river, he made his decision. Not a bold move. Not a reckless gamble. But a deliberate, conscious step forward. To engage with the fallout, to navigate the hidden currents, to act with awareness and purpose. The city awoke slowly, unaware of the invisible calculations shaping its day. People went about their routines, oblivious to the threads tugged above them. And he watched, listening, calculating, preparing. For the fallout was not a moment, it was a force. And he would move within it, not above it, not against it, but alongside it, learning, adapting, enduring. Because the truth was simple: you cannot control everything. You cannot anticipate every twist. You cannot prevent every consequence. But you can see the structure, understand the currents, and choose your path deliberately. That choice, that awareness, is what separates survival from collapse. And in the quiet moments, he reflected on the paradox: the fallout that terrified him was also the gift. It revealed weakness. It exposed truth. It offered insight. And insight, when embraced without ego or fear, became power, not the kind that headlines celebrate, but the kind that ensures resilience, understanding, and the ability to act wisely in a world that is never still. The question remained, lingering like smoke in a darkened room: who would shape the next chapter? Who would bend the currents, and who would be carried along? And as he watched the city pulse with life beneath him, he felt something rare: clarity within chaos, calm within tension, and purpose amidst uncertainty. And that was the night the fallout whispered back. The city had a heartbeat, and he felt it in his chest. Not the literal pulse of traffic or sirens, but something deeper, an invisible rhythm that dictated everything: trust, betrayal, ambition, survival. And that rhythm was changing. New information arrived, almost imperceptibly at first. A phone call from a source who spoke in fragments. A document appearing on a secure server. A whispered name in a corridor no one else had noticed. Each detail seemed small, insignificant even, until he connected the dots. And then the pattern emerged, stark, unavoidable, terrifying in its clarity. The world outside continued unaware. People went about their routines, commuting, buying coffee, checking messages, scrolling news feeds. They saw headlines, flashes of scandal, political quarrels. But they did not see the architecture behind the chaos. They did not see the human threads woven through a system designed to endure, adapt, and survive. He began to map it. Connections, alliances, betrayals, opportunities. Every meeting, every dinner, every offhand remark, suddenly crucial. The machine had layers. Hidden, interconnected, and alive. And he realized, knowledge alone was not enough. Interpretation was key. Insight demanded discernment, and discernment demanded focus. And focus was expensive. The cost was sleepless nights, endless contemplation, and a sense of isolation that weighed heavier with each revelation. But he welcomed it. Isolation, clarity, these were the tools he needed. Without them, the storm could have consumed him. With them, he might just navigate it. He recalled moments from years past, encounters dismissed as trivial. They weren't trivial. Every handshake, every nod, every carefully chosen word was part of a network he had only now begun to see. And in seeing it, he recognized a difficult truth: he had underestimated the intelligence, patience, and ruthlessness of the people around him. The revelations continued. Flight logs, private messages, financial transfers, not random, not careless. Each move calculated, deliberate, designed to shield, conceal, or manipulate. The machine had always been there, humming beneath the surface. He had been part of it, participating, observing, thinking he controlled it. But control had been an illusion. He realized this with a shiver. And yet, he was not powerless. Awareness gave him leverage. Insight gave him strategy. Even in a system designed to be impenetrable, knowledge was a weapon, and understanding its patterns was armor. The storm had taught him many things: fear, patience, the fragility of perception. But now, the revelations were teaching him something else: patience combined with discernment could be decisive. Action without comprehension was reckless. But action with awareness could shift outcomes. Late at night, he sat at a desk piled with notes, maps, and screens. The glow from monitors reflected in his eyes, casting shadows across his face. Outside, the city whispered: engines, footsteps, distant laughter. The storm was gone, but the tension remained, more subtle, more insidious. It flowed through walls, corridors, connections, a current he could feel if he paused long enough to listen. He traced lines again, mapping relationships, loyalties, dependencies. The names that had surfaced in the previous fallout were only the beginning. There were layers beneath layers, and for every secret revealed, another waited patiently, almost expectantly, to be discovered. It was a labyrinth, and he was only beginning to walk its corridors. And then came the human element, the unpredictability. Not everything could be traced, logged, predicted. People were not machines. Some acted out of fear, others out of loyalty, some from ambition, others from desperation. Every action, no matter how small, could ripple outward in ways impossible to foresee. And the realization hit him: the system was a living organism, adaptive, resilient, and sometimes cruelly efficient. But insight allowed him to anticipate, to observe patterns, to make choices with precision. Not control, not domination, just navigation. And navigation could be enough. He remembered the night he first realized the extent of the storm. The fear that had gripped him. The doubts that had threatened to paralyze him. And now, faced with the deepening revelations, he understood the paradox: the storm is not only a test, it is a teacher. Chaos exposes patterns. Pressure exposes character. Knowledge exposes responsibility. And responsibility was heavy. He had seen others falter, succumb, retreat. He had felt the temptation to disengage, to let the currents carry him wherever they pleased. But he knew, awareness without action is useless. Insight without application is wasted. And he would not waste this knowledge. The revelations unfolded relentlessly. Each discovery carried weight. Each connection shifted his understanding of who could be trusted, who could be leveraged, who could be a threat. The city, in its quiet persistence, became a mirror for his own consciousness, layered, complex, unpredictable. And navigating it required humility as much as cunning. At one point, he stepped onto the balcony, night wind biting at his face. The city sprawled beneath him, glowing in streetlights, headlights, neon reflections. And he realized something fundamental: the truth is rarely neat. Revelations are rarely convenient. And clarity is often accompanied by discomfort. Yet he embraced it. The machine, the city, the storm, the fallout, they were all part of a living narrative. And his role within it was now defined not by power, not by headline, not by influence, but by perception, awareness, and deliberate action. He could see the currents. He could feel the flows. And in that, he found purpose. Purpose, he understood, was different from control. Control is fleeting. Influence is fragile. But purpose endures. And with purpose, he could navigate the chaos without losing himself to it. The revelations were not complete. They never would be. But each one illuminated a path forward, each one clarified decisions, each one offered insight into the hidden architecture of the city and the people who moved within it. And for a moment, standing there above the streets, he felt a strange calm. The storm, the tension, the fallout, all had brought him here, to awareness, to clarity, to readiness. He could not know what would come next. He could only prepare, adapt, and act. And in that preparation, he understood the ultimate truth: knowledge is survival. Insight is power. And even in a system designed to obscure, deceive, and protect itself, perception remains the greatest weapon. The night stretched around him, quiet now, almost reverent. The city hummed beneath, a living organism continuing its rhythm, unaware that someone above it had glimpsed the deeper currents. And he would move with them, not against them, not above them, but in harmony with understanding. Because the revelations, though daunting, had given him one thing that power alone never could: perspective. And that was the night the hidden threads became visible. The morning broke, but it brought no relief. Sunlight spilled over the city, painting rooftops in gold, but beneath the warmth, tension lingered like smoke after a fire. The storm of revelations had passed, yes, but the fallout was far from over. It had begun to manifest, in whispers, in leaks, in movements too subtle to be captured by the headlines. He felt it immediately. Advisors moved with hesitation, unsure which path was safe. Allies debated quietly in corners, weighing loyalty against survival. Enemies lurked in the shadows, calculating, patient, precise. And the city itself seemed aware. The streets thrummed with unease, the lights reflected uncertainty, and the air carried a sense that the equilibrium had shifted. The first consequences were small, almost imperceptible. A campaign postponed. A meeting rescheduled. A handshake refused. Yet each minor tremor carried weight, a hint that larger ripples were coming. And he understood, in this system, even small disruptions could cascade, unbalancing the delicate architecture of power and influence. He moved through the day with deliberate care, aware that every word, every gesture, every glance could be interpreted in ways he could not fully predict. The fallout was not just external. It was internal, in the corridors of his mind, in the calculus of decisions, in the invisible ledger of trust and betrayal. Every misstep risked collapse. Every choice carried consequence. By midday, the situation escalated. A trusted ally, one he had relied upon for years, revealed an unexpected position, a hesitation that bordered on opposition. It was subtle, almost polite, but unmistakable. And in that moment, he saw the fragile scaffolding of his network sway. The system, designed to be resilient, had found its vulnerability, human unpredictability. And then came the public response. Headlines erupted with interpretations, speculations, and half-truths. Social media amplified uncertainty, turning facts into conjecture, narratives into judgment. Citizens reacted, not to reality, but to perception. And he realized again, perception could be as powerful as the truth, sometimes more so, especially when the truth was layered, complex, and inconvenient. He retreated briefly to a quiet room, screens glowing with the stories cascading in real time. Every alert, every notification, every message felt like a spark against dry tinder. And he understood, containment was impossible. The consequences would spread, unpredictable, unstoppable, demanding constant vigilance. The tension was palpable, physical almost. It coursed through the office, the city, the streets, the networks of influence, connecting people, choices, and outcomes in ways both visible and invisible. And he felt it in his chest, in his gut, in the shallow rhythm of breath. The crisis was no longer abstract. It was tangible. Immediate. Dangerous. Decisions had to be made. Alliances reassessed. Priorities redefined. He convened his inner circle once more, voices low, faces tight with concern. The room itself felt smaller, charged with anticipation. Every proposal, every plan, every suggestion carried with it the potential to stabilize or destabilize the fragile equilibrium. Outside, the city responded. Employees hesitated, meetings were delayed, and whispers traveled faster than the facts. The environment was reactive, volatile, a reflection of the unseen currents moving above it. And he realized, the fallout did not respect boundaries. It did not pause for strategy or reflection. It moved, relentlessly, reshaping every interaction, every assumption, every trust. He thought of past choices, decisions made in clarity or fear, in confidence or ignorance. Each one had consequences, some immediate, some delayed, some subtle, some profound. And now, as the crisis deepened, he understood that the sum of those choices had created the landscape in which he moved. He could not change the past, only navigate its echoes. By evening, the consequences manifested more tangibly. Partnerships strained. Conversations became loaded with meaning. Emails, texts, and phone calls carried undertones of tension. And in that web, he felt the cost of leadership, the burden of awareness, the weight of responsibility. Not for fame, not for power, not for reputation, but for survival, clarity, and understanding. The storm of revelations had been an awakening. The fallout, he realized, was the test. And the test demanded presence, focus, and courage. Every decision now was amplified, scrutinized, and irreversible. Missteps could cascade. Misjudgments could become crises. And he had to act with foresight, decisiveness, and precision. He stepped out onto the balcony as night fell, lights flickering across streets and rooftops. The city seemed alive in a new way, restless, uncertain, vibrant. The consequences of the day had reshaped its rhythm, altered its pulse. And he saw clearly, the fallout was not an enemy to fight, but a force to understand, to navigate, to endure. And in that moment, he whispered to himself. You can anticipate. You can prepare. You can act. But the world will always move faster than you expect. And he felt the paradox settle in, consequences are inevitable, but awareness can turn inevitability into opportunity. Danger can become clarity. Chaos can become insight. And the storm outside, the storm within, the storm of human action and reaction, all of it could be a teacher, if he chose to learn. He thought of the people whose actions had sparked this crisis, the alliances tested, the loyalties questioned. Each human choice carried magnitude, consequences that rippled outward, reshaping not just events, but perception, trust, and power. And he understood, the human element, unpredictable and messy, was the most powerful force in the system. By midnight, the city had settled into a tense rhythm. The fallout had revealed vulnerabilities, exposed truths, and tested courage. And he, standing above it all, understood that the next steps would require calm, insight, and deliberate courage. Survival depended not on reaction alone, but on understanding, anticipation, and presence of mind. And in the quiet, he reflected on a simple truth: consequences are the measure of action. Every decision, every choice, every word carries weight. And the storm of fallout, relentless as it is also the instrument by which clarity, strength, and resilience are forged. He turned away from the balcony, letting the night wash over him, the city continuing its pulse, unaware of the calculations and considerations above it. And he understood, the fallout would continue. Consequences would deepen. But he was awake now, aware now, prepared now. And that was the night the crisis made itself undeniable. The city held its breath. Not literally, engines hummed, lights blinked, pedestrians moved, but in the spaces between, a tension so sharp it could slice through steel had settled. Decisions were no longer theoretical. Choices were no longer abstract. The moment for action had arrived. He felt it in his bones. The weight of awareness, the accumulation of revelations, the inevitability of consequences, all converged in a single point. And at that point, hesitation was not an option. The decisive move demanded clarity, courage, and precision. He gathered his closest advisors. The room was quiet but charged. Papers, screens, and encrypted messages were scattered across the table like fragments of a shattered mirror. Every shard reflected potential outcomes, every reflection a warning. And in that silence, he felt the rhythm of the machine beneath it all, humming, observing, waiting. "This is it," he said, voice low but steady. "We act now, or we become part of what acts against us." Eyes met his. Some were tense, some confident, some uncertain. Each person understood the stakes. Every move carried risk, every misstep consequences that could not be undone. Yet in that charged atmosphere, there was purpose. Determination. Resolve. The plan was not dramatic. It was not flashy. It was deliberate, layered, strategic. It involved patience, observation, and subtle pressure. The goal was not to dominate, but to shift currents, to anticipate reactions, to guide outcomes without breaking the fragile balance. He reflected briefly on the journey that had led here, the storm, the revelations, the fallout, the consequences. Each moment had been preparation, each challenge a rehearsal for this instant. And he understood, with a calm intensity, that the decisive move was not about proving power. It was about demonstrating presence, awareness, and calculated courage. Outside, the city pulsed with life. Neon reflected on wet asphalt, headlights traced fluid lines, the hum of engines was punctuated by distant sirens. And yet, beneath the everyday chaos, a subtle change had begun. The currents he had studied, the patterns he had mapped, now they bent slightly in response to deliberate action. Small shifts, almost imperceptible, but significant. He moved through the day with measured steps, his team following the choreography of awareness he had outlined. Every meeting, every phone call, every message was a calculated move, a piece of a larger puzzle. And he watched closely, noting reactions, recording outcomes, adjusting plans in real time. Tension was everywhere. Not just in the streets, not just in the corridors of power, but in the air itself. People responded to subtle cues: hesitation, confidence, tone of voice, timing. The decisive move demanded that he control not just action, but perception. Influence, after all, is often invisible. He remembered nights spent tracing connections, mapping alliances, understanding loyalties. All of it had led to this moment. And in that memory, he felt the paradox of strategy: the more visible the plan, the more fragile it becomes, the more subtle, the more powerful. And yet, despite meticulous planning, uncertainty remained. The human element, unpredictable, irrational, courageous, or cowardly, could not be fully contained. Every step forward was a negotiation with chance, with perception, with consequence. And he welcomed it. The decisive move required awareness, but also courage, and courage demanded action. He paused on the balcony again as night fell. The city stretched beneath him, alive, oblivious, vibrant. And he felt the weight of responsibility settle firmly. The storm had tested him. The fallout had revealed the structure. The consequences had sharpened focus. Now it was time for action, deliberate, decisive, necessary. The first steps were small. Strategic meetings, subtle communications, quiet pressure applied where influence mattered most. Every interaction was measured, every word chosen, every gesture intentional. And with each step, he watched for ripples, the reactions of allies, the hesitation of opponents, the movement of those whose loyalties were uncertain. By late evening, the impact became visible. Shifts in alliances, recalibrated strategies, quiet acknowledgments of influence, proof that the decisive move, though subtle, was working. And he understood a vital truth: power is rarely seized in dramatic bursts. It is guided, managed, orchestrated with awareness of currents, anticipation of reactions, and courage to act when observation alone is insufficient. There were moments of tension. Messages arrived with delays, calls required rapid judgment, minor conflicts threatened to derail the flow. And in those moments, he reminded himself, control is never total, perception is never absolute, consequence is inevitable. But insight, patience, and deliberate action can bend the currents just enough to navigate chaos without being consumed. He remembered the human cost. Choices carried weight. Missteps could damage lives, alliances, trust. And yet, inaction would have consequences too. Survival, clarity, and integrity demanded balance, and the decisive move was that balance in motion, precise, calculated, aware. Outside, the city's pulse reflected his own. Neon lights flickered, shadows moved, distant traffic traced lines of light on rain-slicked streets. It was ordinary life, yet extraordinary in its invisibility, the very environment where influence, action, and consequence intertwined. And he navigated it with full awareness. Hours later, after decisions had been executed, communications dispatched, and reactions observed, he allowed himself a brief pause. The first wave of impact had passed. Shifts were visible. Patterns had changed. Currents had bent in subtle but meaningful ways. The decisive move was complete, at least for now. And in the quiet that followed, he felt an echo of understanding: the world is rarely conquered by brute force. It is navigated by insight. It is endured through awareness. It is guided by courage tempered with patience. The decisive move is not dramatic, it is deliberate, intentional, and measured. He stepped back from the window, letting the city hum beneath him, lights glowing, people moving, life continuing. And in that reflection, he whispered to himself: "The storm bends, but it does not break. And neither will I." For the first time in days, he allowed a small sense of accomplishment, not triumph, not victory, but awareness. The currents had shifted. The structure of influence had responded. The decisive move had been executed with clarity and purpose. And yet, he knew this was only a step in a journey that was far from over. And that was the night the currents finally began to bend. The night arrived quietly, but the city was far from calm. Beneath the surface of ordinary life, tensions had begun to twist, tangle, and pull at the edges of everything he had so carefully constructed. The decisive move had shifted currents, yes, but with that shift came friction, instability, and new unpredictability. He felt it immediately. A subtle hesitation in a voice he had trusted. A pause in a correspondence he had assumed reliable. An absence where presence was expected. Each anomaly, small on its own, was a thread pulling against the fabric of order he had established. And he understood the truth: the system tolerated no half-measures, no mistakes, no complacency. The unraveling was quiet at first. Emails left unanswered. Meetings delayed. Strategic partners testing the boundaries of loyalty. And yet, within that quiet, the pattern was clear. The currents he had bent were fighting back. The storm had not ended, it had merely transformed. He moved through his day with deliberate observation, eyes scanning every expression, ears tuned to every nuance, mind mapping every interaction. Every gesture carried meaning, every word concealed layers. Human behavior, unpredictable as it was, became both obstacle and signal, offering warnings and insight if interpreted correctly. The city mirrored his inner tension. Streets buzzed with ordinary life, but every footstep seemed charged, every engine note a rhythm echoing hidden currents. Neon signs reflected not just light but the subtle impermanence of perception. The storm had left its mark, awareness was no longer optional, vigilance mandatory. And the consequences of miscalculation were immediate. A minor misstep in a phone call led to subtle opposition. A poorly timed message sowed doubt where confidence had been expected. Allies hesitated, enemies advanced, and the fragile scaffolding of influence threatened to buckle under invisible pressure. He convened his inner circle, the room tense, the air thick with unspoken fears. Every proposal carried risk. Every plan, potential fallout. And in that space, he realized the paradox: the more deliberate the action, the more fragile the balance. Precision demanded awareness, awareness demanded patience, and patience demanded courage. Outside, the city responded in whispers and glances. People reacted to cues they barely understood. A sidewalk protest, a delayed broadcast, an unexpected inquiry, small signs of movement, hints that currents were shifting again. And he understood, perception was a force unto itself, often more potent than reality. He retraced the steps that had led to this unraveling. Each revelation, each fallout, each consequence, they were threads in a tapestry he had assumed he controlled. And yet, the tapestry was alive, moving in ways both subtle and decisive, shaped by forces he could not command: human choice. And therein lay the lesson: unpredictability is not weakness. It is reality. It is the element that defines systems, relationships, and power. One misstep, one hesitation, one overlooked signal can cascade, creating effects disproportionate to their origin. The unraveling was not a failure, it was a test. A lesson in navigation, endurance, and awareness. He walked through the city at night, lights reflecting off wet pavement, the faint hum of traffic and distant voices filling the air. The environment itself seemed alive, reactive, a mirror of the tensions and currents at play above and below. And he sensed that the unfolding consequences were as much about human nature as strategy, about perception as action, about vigilance as courage. By midnight, the unraveling was undeniable. Minor breaches in loyalty had become visible fractures. Strategic plans required rapid adjustment. Communications needed recalibration. And yet, amidst the chaos, he found clarity: the storm does not destroy those who observe, adapt, and act. It only tests the limits of insight and resilience. He remembered the lessons of the past: the storm, the revelations, the fallout, the consequences, the decisive move, each a step in preparation for this very moment. And now, confronted with the raw unpredictability of human behavior and systemic friction, he realized the importance of calm, deliberate awareness. Panic would amplify chaos. Precision could bend it. The city itself seemed to recognize the tension. Neon reflected uncertainty. Rain-slicked streets shimmered with ambiguity. Every shadow, every movement hinted at currents invisible to the untrained eye. And he moved through it, observing, calculating, responding, every step a balance between action and patience, influence and perception, courage and caution. He convened a small team in the quiet hours. Strategic recalibration, not reactionary panic, was required. Every detail was examined. Every possibility considered. And he reminded them, the unraveling is not failure. It is information. It is opportunity. It is the system revealing itself to those willing to observe. And as he stepped back, gazing over the city, he whispered a truth to himself. The system bends. It strains. It tests. But it does not forgive ignorance. The unraveling was not yet complete. Currents continued to twist. Reactions propagated unpredictably. Human choice, flawed, unpredictable, vital, created movement where none was expected. But he was ready. He had seen patterns before, traced connections, observed responses. The storm of unpredictability would not consume him. It would teach him. It would sharpen him. It would define him. He walked to the balcony, night wind biting at his face, the city glowing beneath him. And he realized the truth that always accompanies tension: clarity is born in observation. Courage is forged in uncertainty. Awareness is honed by chaos. And those who endure do so not because they control, but because they perceive, adapt, and act with precision. The unraveling would continue. It would strain relationships, test loyalty, expose weaknesses. And it would not wait for anyone. But he understood the currents now, felt them in his pulse, and knew how to move within them. Awareness, patience, courage, action, these were the tools that would carry him through. And in the quiet, almost reverently, he whispered. And that was the night the hidden threads began to strain. The city felt different that morning. Not in sound, not in movement, but in the spaces between, the quiet tension that hummed beneath everything. The unraveling had reached a point where hesitation was no longer safe. The currents had twisted, stretched, and shifted, and he realized with stark clarity, the turning point had arrived. He sat at the edge of a table, maps and messages scattered like fragments of a fragmented reality. Each note, each line, each encrypted detail was a clue, a thread, a key. And now, those threads demanded action. Analysis alone would no longer suffice. Insight demanded execution. Observation demanded courage. Awareness demanded a choice. Allies gathered around, faces tense, voices low. The weight of decisions pressed in like the walls themselves were closing. Every suggestion carried the potential to stabilize or unravel further. Every recommendation carried consequences he could not entirely predict. And in that charged space, he understood the truth he had learned so many times before: clarity is not absence of chaos. Clarity is endurance amidst it. The turning point was not dramatic. There were no explosions, no confrontations, no cinematic reveals. It was quiet. Subtle. Deliberate. And yet, its impact was profound. Decisions made now would reverberate through the currents he had spent weeks navigating. One misstep could fracture alliances, one misjudgment could expose vulnerability, one hesitation could invite disaster. He began with observation. Small tests of loyalty, subtle probes of influence, minor adjustments to timing and communication. The currents responded almost immediately: hesitations, confirmations, recalibrations. And he felt the paradox of strategy settle over him: the more delicate the intervention, the greater its potential to alter outcomes. By midday, patterns emerged. Allies reaffirmed positions, subtle but decisive. Rivals showed cracks, hesitation revealing vulnerabilities that could be leveraged without aggression. And he realized, the turning point was not about power, but about perception. Not domination, but influence. Not force, but alignment. The emotional weight pressed in. He recalled the storm, the revelations, the fallout, the consequences, the decisive move, the unraveling, each a lesson in awareness, resilience, and strategy. And now, at the turning point, all of it coalesced. Experience sharpened intuition. Insight guided action. Courage sustained momentum. A single phone call became pivotal. Words exchanged carried layers of meaning. Tone, timing, cadence, each element was observed, interpreted, and acted upon. And the response came, measured, deliberate, aligned. The currents shifted again, subtly but irreversibly. The turning point was manifest. He paused on the balcony that evening, wind cutting softly across his face, the city below alive with unknowing energy. Streetlights reflected on wet pavements, cars traced lines of light like glowing veins. And he understood a fundamental truth: the world is rarely dramatic in its transformations. Shifts occur quietly, invisibly, in the ripples of decisions, in the alignment of currents, in the acknowledgement of insight. The emotional climax of the day was not an outburst, but a quiet affirmation. He had anticipated reactions, observed loyalties, and executed choices that bent the currents toward alignment. And in that quiet success, he felt the rare mix of satisfaction and relief, not triumph, not dominance, but awareness fulfilled. The human element was still present, unpredictable, emotional, flawed. But now, it could be guided. Allies had clarity. Rivals had revealed themselves. The system, alive as it was, responded to deliberate action rather than panic. And he realized, the turning point is not merely about action. It is about mastery of presence, perception, and patience. He reflected on the cost. Every decision, every calibration, every observation had exacted a toll: sleepless nights, tension, moral weight, isolation. And yet, in that crucible, he had discovered something vital: awareness combined with courage can transform chaos into opportunity. Insight combined with execution can bend currents, without breaking them. By nightfall, the city hummed with quiet movement. People moved in routines oblivious to the invisible orchestration above them. Yet beneath their feet, beneath the streets, beneath the lights, the currents had shifted. Patterns aligned. Loyalties clarified. Influence extended. The turning point had been achieved, subtle, deliberate, powerful. And he whispered to himself, almost reverently. The storm tests. The currents respond. And we endure. He allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. The tension of the unraveling had sharpened his perception. The weight of consequences had reinforced his awareness. And the decisive actions of the turning point had confirmed something he had always known, yet never fully embraced: clarity is not absence of challenge. Clarity is persistence within it. Courage is not absence of fear. Courage is deliberate action despite it. The night stretched around him, soft and muted, neon flickering through windows, distant engines tracing the city's pulse. And he understood that the turning point, though achieved, was only a moment in a continuum. There would be further tests, further consequences, further revelations. But for now, the alignment was clear. The currents, though fragile, were navigable. The storm, though present, was manageable. He traced the trajectory of decisions, anticipating the next wave of reactions, and realized something profound: the turning point is not a climax in isolation. It is the intersection of past choices, present clarity, and future potential. It is where preparation meets awareness, where courage meets insight, where human imperfection meets deliberate execution. And in that understanding, he felt the quiet satisfaction of mastery, not over the city, not over people, not over power itself, but over perception, clarity, and deliberate action. The turning point was both a conclusion and a beginning, a hinge upon which the next chapter would swing. He stepped back from the balcony, letting the night wash over him, the city continuing its rhythm beneath. And in a quiet whisper, a truth carried only to those who listened. And that was the night the currents aligned. The city exhaled. Not loudly, not in acknowledgement, but subtly, in the rhythm of traffic, in the quiet hum of streetlights, in the distant conversations of people unaware they were part of a larger story. The storm had shifted, the currents had bent, and the turning point had passed. Now came the aftermath. He walked through the streets with a sense of observation sharpened by the days behind him. Neon reflections glimmered on wet asphalt, car engines hummed softly, and the night air carried a mix of anticipation and relief. Life was continuing, ordinary and yet profoundly altered by invisible decisions. The consequences of his decisive actions were now visible. Allies had realigned. Rivals had reconsidered. Friction points had shifted. And through it all, he felt the weight of the choices he had made, heavy, inevitable, and necessary. Every word, every gesture, every subtle maneuver had contributed to the new equilibrium. Yet the human cost lingered. He thought of the sleepless nights, the moral compromises, the tense conversations that had tested trust and loyalty. The storm had exacted a toll. And in the quiet streets, he realized that reflection was as essential as action. Awareness demanded not just vigilance, but understanding. Not just insight, but humility. He paused at a corner cafe, watching people move, unaware of the forces that had shaped the city above and below their consciousness. Their lives carried on, mundane, persistent, resilient. And in their persistence, he saw a lesson: the world endures, even amidst storms, revelations, consequences, and crises. The aftermath was not dramatic. There were no cheers, no proclamations, no banners raised. It was quiet. Subtle. Persistent. The city had settled into a rhythm once more, yet one tempered by awareness. People were resilient. Systems adapted. Currents continued to flow. And he realized, calm after the storm is not absence of change. It is acceptance of consequence. He returned to his office, lights dimmed, screens reflecting softly in the quiet room. He reviewed the events, the outcomes, the subtle shifts that had occurred. Some actions had exceeded expectation, others had revealed hidden vulnerabilities. And through it all, he felt a clarity born not of victory, but of endurance, insight, and deliberate observation. The human element remained. Not all had reacted predictably. Not all alliances were secure. Not all consequences fully visible. But the aftermath offered perspective. It revealed patterns. It illuminated truth. And he understood that reflection, patience, and presence were as crucial in calm as they had been in crisis. He stepped onto the balcony once more. The city stretched below, glowing softly under the night sky, quiet, ordinary, resilient. And he felt a strange serenity, not triumph, not victory, but understanding. Awareness, action, and consequence had converged, leaving clarity in their wake. He whispered to himself. The storm passes. Currents shift. And we endure. Moments of human truth revealed themselves. Subtle interactions, a hesitant nod, a quiet apology, a word of loyalty, became markers of stability. And he recognized a profound truth: the aftermath is not simply consequence, it is insight made tangible. It is where the lessons of chaos are encoded into behavior, where awareness shapes the next steps, where courage transforms into resilience. In the quiet hours, he reflected on the paradox: the storm had been terrifying, the fallout dangerous, the turning point decisive, yet it was the aftermath that revealed what truly mattered. Not power, not perception, not influence, but clarity, understanding, endurance, and the capacity to act with both courage and humility. He allowed himself a rare pause. The weight of responsibility remained, but the immediate crisis had passed. The currents had aligned, fragile but navigable. The city hummed, life persisted, and the human element, unpredictable as ever, had adapted. And in that adaptation, he found reassurance. Outside, the rain began to fall softly, tapping against windows, glinting on the streets, reflecting neon in fragile, fleeting patterns. The city, resilient as ever, absorbed the droplets. And he understood, storms come and go, currents bend and shift, but life endures. Adaptation is continuous, vigilance is constant, and human resilience remains unbroken. The aftermath was not about celebration. It was about understanding. Not about applause, but awareness. Not about triumph, but endurance. The city and its people would carry on, shaped by events, yet resilient, moving forward in patterns visible only to those willing to observe. And he felt a quiet gratitude for the lessons learned. Insight gained through storm and revelation, patience honed through consequence, courage tested through decisive action, these were tools that no storm could take away. They were the instruments by which survival, clarity, and understanding were forged. He turned from the balcony, lights dimmed, night quiet, city alive. And he whispered, almost to himself, almost as a meditation. And that was the night clarity found its place. The city moved, almost unaware, carrying on as though nothing had shifted. Yet beneath the surface, the lessons of the past days had settled into the currents of human behavior, into quiet alliances, into decisions that would ripple forward. The storm, the revelations, the fallout, the decisive moves, the unraveling, the turning point, all of it had left its mark. And now, the lessons remained. He sat in his office, windows open to the night, city lights glimmering like constellations beneath him. Reflection was no longer optional. Insight demanded pause. Action had consequences, understanding required observation. And in that quiet, he could see the patterns emerge, human, systemic, inevitable, yet navigable. The first lesson was resilience. The storm had tested endurance, patience, courage, and clarity. The fallout had tested alliances, perception, and loyalty. And through it all, he realized that survival is not about control, not about dominance, not about perception, it is about endurance, awareness, and adaptability. Life bends, but it does not break. Systems fluctuate, but they respond. Humans falter, but they endure. The second lesson was perception. Reality is often layered, elusive, mediated by human interpretation. What appears clear may be obscured by bias, by misunderstanding, by inattention. And yet, the currents, if observed, if traced with care, reveal patterns. Insight is seeing what others overlook. Awareness is recognizing that perception is as potent as fact. And action guided by insight shapes outcomes in ways raw force cannot. The third lesson was courage. Not the kind of heroics sung in stories, but quiet, deliberate courage, the kind that sustains when others hesitate, that navigates uncertainty without panic, that balances morality with necessity. Courage is not absence of fear. It is action in the presence of fear, tempered by judgment and refined by reflection. The fourth lesson was humility. The storm, the fallout, the decisive moves, the unraveling, all demonstrated that no one controls everything. Systems are larger than one mind, currents flow beyond observation, human choice is unpredictable. Humility is recognizing limits, acknowledging uncertainty, and choosing action deliberately, despite not having total control. He walked through the city streets as night deepened, rain reflecting neon, footsteps echoing in quiet alleys. People moved, unaware of the forces that had shaped the currents above them. Yet each of their choices, each interaction, each response, carried echoes of the lessons learned. And he felt a profound connection, to the city, to the human condition, to the invisible threads binding lives, actions, and consequences together. The fifth lesson was observation. Awareness is the instrument of clarity. Insight is forged through careful attention. Every gesture, every hesitation, every word contains meaning if one observes closely. Knowledge is fleeting without perception. Power is fragile without understanding. And the currents, though invisible, reveal themselves to those willing to watch, to listen, to notice. And the sixth lesson, perhaps the most human, was hope. Not naive or blind, but quiet, persistent, reflective. The storm had passed, but life continued. Currents bent, consequences flowed, challenges arose, yet resilience remained. Systems adapted. Humans endured. And in the interplay between chaos and clarity, there exists a space for choice, for courage, for action, for meaning. He paused at a balcony, wind biting, city stretching endlessly beneath him, lights shimmering, distant engines humming. And he realized, the lessons learned were not theoretical. They were alive, practical, human. They would guide the next choice, the next step, the next alignment of currents. And perhaps most importantly, they were enduring. He whispered softly, almost as if to the city itself, almost as if to a future version of himself. Resilience. Awareness. Courage. Humility. Observation. Hope. He looked beyond the streets, beyond the neon, beyond the city itself, and understood the truth that had emerged from every challenge: life is not about control. It is about navigation. Life is not about dominance. It is about alignment with currents, recognition of human patterns, and deliberate, courageous action. And in that understanding, clarity becomes possible. The night air was cool, scented faintly with rain, distant flowers, and exhaust. And he felt a strange serenity, not triumph, not relief, not victory, but awareness, tempered by endurance, sharpened by the trials of the past days. The city moved, currents flowed, humans acted, and he moved with understanding, with patience, with quiet courage. He turned from the balcony, lights dimmed, the quiet hum of the office wrapping around him. And he whispered, almost reverently, to himself and to anyone who might listen. And maybe, that's how it all begins again. The lessons of the storm, the fallout, and the turning point were not finished. They would echo forward, subtle but persistent, shaping decisions, guiding awareness, influencing perception, and reminding those who observe that clarity is earned, endurance is tested, courage is required, and hope is essential. And as the city continued its quiet pulse, he understood the ultimate truth: storms come and go, revelations emerge, consequences unfold, and human choice persists. The currents bend, systems adapt, alliances shift, and life endures. But those who navigate with awareness, deliberate courage, and reflection, they survive, they learn, they grow. And in that endurance, the human story continues, quiet, persistent, alive, and profoundly real. Dawn crept quietly over the city. Not in a burst of glory, not in dramatic fanfare, but in subtle light, brushing rooftops with soft gold, casting long shadows that stretched like memories across the streets. The storm was over. The currents had shifted. The aftermath had settled. And the city, alive, imperfect, resilient, waited for what came next. He stood at the balcony, looking down at streets that carried life in ordinary rhythms. Cars moved. People walked. Windows glimmered with light. And yet, beneath the ordinary, the invisible story of choices, consequences, courage, and awareness lingered, woven into the fabric of the city itself. The light was not merely illumination. It was understanding. Reflection. Clarity. A quiet recognition of all that had passed, all that had been learned, and all that remained to navigate. The lessons, the storms, the turning points, they were not simply history. They were living truths, guiding the next steps, shaping perception, and echoing in the hearts of those who observed carefully. He thought of the human element, unpredictable, messy, flawed, resilient. The people who had reacted with fear, with courage, with loyalty, with hesitation. Every choice, every action, every small decision had left a mark. And in the light of day, those marks were visible in the subtle alignments of trust, the renewed clarity of purpose, the careful recalibration of alliances. And he understood another truth: power is fleeting. Influence is delicate. Perception is fragile. But awareness, resilience, courage, and humility endure. They survive the storms. They survive the fallout. They survive the currents that twist and turn beyond observation. And they shape the course of action when all else is uncertain. He walked through the quiet city streets, rain-soaked from the night before, the reflections of neon fading as sunlight emerged. Every step was deliberate, every observation intentional. And he realized that the light, literal and metaphorical, revealed more than surfaces. It revealed patterns, it revealed choices, it revealed human truth. The lessons of the past days coalesced in his mind: resilience in the face of chaos, awareness in the midst of uncertainty, courage when action demanded it, humility before the limits of control, observation to see what others overlooked, and hope that persisted even when the storm seemed endless. These were not abstract concepts. They were instruments, alive and practical, shaping the present and guiding the future. He paused on a quiet bridge, looking at the river reflecting the morning sky. The water moved, currents invisible beneath its surface, carrying everything forward, past, present, future, in relentless flow. And he saw the analogy clearly: life is like this river. Currents twist. Storms ripple the surface. Obstacles appear. Yet it flows onward, resilient, persistent, shaping the world as it moves. He whispered to himself, soft as the dawn light. Freedom isn't guaranteed. It's passed down, one brave choice at a time. Every echo of the storm, every tremor of the unraveling, every subtle shift of the turning point, all of it converged in understanding. Life is not about control, not about domination, not about victory. It is about endurance, insight, deliberate action, and human truth. It is about learning from chaos without being consumed by it. It is about observing currents, anticipating movement, and choosing courage amidst uncertainty. And in that quiet, reflective space, he felt hope, not loud, not triumphant, but steady, persistent, enduring. The city moved. Humans acted. Choices continued. Consequences unfolded. And yet, within that flow, the possibility for deliberate, courageous, aware action remained. The storm had passed, but life, real, human, messy, resilient life, continued. He turned from the bridge, stepping onto streets that were now bathed in soft sunlight. Conversations, movement, laughter, work, all continued. And he understood: the light is never only illumination. It is perception. It is understanding. It is the quiet persistence of human awareness guiding action, shaping outcomes, and revealing truths that endure beyond chaos. In that moment, he whispered again, a truth carried softly, meant for anyone listening, meant for himself, meant for the world. So when your moment comes, what will you stand for? The wind moved gently through the city. Windows rattled softly. Distant voices carried across streets. And in that ambient rhythm, he understood the final lesson: clarity is earned, courage is tested, human truth is constant, and hope, even fragile and quiet, is the light that endures when all else has passed. He looked one last time at the city, at the patterns of movement, at the subtle alignments, at the currents that now flowed differently than they had days before. And he whispered, almost a meditation, almost a secret shared only with those paying attention. And maybe, that's how it all begins again. The light illuminated not just buildings and streets, but awareness. It revealed the invisible threads of human action, consequence, perception, and courage. And in that illumination, the story was complete, not in endings, not in triumph, not in victory, but in human truth, quiet resilience, and enduring hope. And as the city continued its rhythms, alive and imperceptible, he walked forward into the day, carrying with him the lessons of storms endured, currents navigated, and choices made with courage and awareness. Because that is how life continues. That is how clarity emerges. That is how human truth persists. And that is the light.